Occasional disturbing scenes.
Next on Secrets of War. From Germany's Big Bertha and World War I to Iraq's top-secret Project Babylon, they are the ultimate projection of force. Secret cannons designed to strike their target from miles away. Handheld rifles that pack the power of the atom, and superguns capable of launching satellites into space. Superguns is next on Secrets of War.
It has been said that national boundaries are drawn in one of two ways, with pens or with guns. Unfortunately, the 20th century saw more of the latter as warring nations used guns as their principal means to project power. In secret laboratories and on military proving grounds the world over, engineers have sought to make these guns more powerful, more accurate, and more deadly. Of all weapons in the artillery arsenal, perhaps none is more awe-inspiring than the big gun. These are the super cannons on the field of war, shooting higher and farther, forever changing the course of battle and history. The story of superguns dates back more than 500 years when cannons first appeared on the battlefield.
It must have made a tremendous impression the first time people who were used to bows and arrows found themselves being attacked by projectiles that didn't need muscle power to throw them, but were thrown by this new chemical device, which was gunpowder.
As cannons grew larger and more accurate, improvements in gunpowder increased their range, but the mechanics of artillery remained virtually unchanged for more than 500 years. The standard guns of the American Civil War were loaded, aimed, and fired much the same as were its ancestors from the 14th century. As the 19th century came to a close, however, artillery changed dramatically.
The two key events of the 19th century as far as artillery is concerned, one is breech loading, the other is rifling.
Small grooves in the inside of a gun's barrel, called rifling, caused artillery rounds to rotate, improving their range and accuracy. Rifling also allowed for heavier, more streamlined shells. Breech loading made refiring quicker, and recoil systems allowed a gun to be fired without repositioning and re-aiming after every shot. The First World War saw modern, large-caliber, breech-loading artillery wreak destruction on a scale unimaginable in previous conflicts.
The First World War was the great artillery war. It was a huge conflict, a struggle between two sides who had all of the technology of both their societies ranged behind them.
In the volatile political climate in Europe at the end of the 19th century, Belgium recognized its vulnerability and and built a series of forts designed to withstand the most powerful field artillery of the day. Behind these forts, the small country was convinced of its security. The Belgians had no idea Germany was building a supergun beyond what anyone thought possible. Big Bertha took its name from Baroness Bertha Krupp, the granddaughter of Alfred Krupp, the German gunmaker. Originally designed as a coastal gun, the 42-centimeter howitzer weighed in excess of 40 tons. It was so immense that it had to be transported in pieces and assembled on site. In August of 1914, the Germans transported their super gun to the outskirts of the Belgian town of Liège, where 12 state-of-the-art forts guarded the border.
Although nobody ever talks about the Kaiser's secret weapon, those 42-centimeter howitzers certainly were a secret weapon. And the fact that the Germans not only had two guns, but deployed them with a field army, guns of that size, was astonishing.
The thing about the 42-centimeter howitzer is that it fired a shell, which is equivalent in weight to a small car, to a range of between 6 and 7 miles, at high angle, so that at the peak of its trajectory, the shell had the added assistance of the force of gravity. And if you can imagine the impact of that upon a brick building, it would probably pulverize it into small little bits of dust.
The Belgian forts were no match for the German supergun. Within 3 days, those that hadn't been destroyed were surrendered.
The Big Bertha was a very effective weapon in smashing forts. And it shocked everyone on the Allied side because these forts were considered artillery-proof.
From Liège, the massive guns moved through Belgium and into France with the same devastating effect. 5 Big Berthas were eventually built and continued to rain destruction down on the Allies until the end of 1917, when their limited range made them targets for Allied counter-battery attacks. Still, the Germans had another supergun in the works, and it would change everybody's idea of the limits of artillery. At 7:18 on the morning of the 23rd of March, 1918, the peace in Paris was shattered by an explosion. The citizens thought it was an air raid, but no airplanes had been seen or heard. By the end of the day, there were 22 such explosions. 15 people lay dead, another 36 were wounded. Only when shell fragments were found and analyzed did French officials realize that airplanes were not responsible for the destruction. Paris had been the victim of a terrifying new weapon, a long-range supergun. It's understandable that this conclusion wasn't arrived at sooner. The best land artillery of the day had a range of about 23 miles, and the front was nearly 80 miles away. More than 3 years earlier, the German advance had stalled and the war ground to a bloody stalemate. The opposing armies dug in, casualties mounted. The German military commanders wanted to strike at the heart and soul of the enemy, not just their men at the front. Aerial bombing of Paris had proved costly and ineffective. In the autumn of 1916, the dilemma was taken to Krupp, the same company that made Big Bertha. In an amazing feat of engineering, a revolutionary long-range gun was made suitable for testing by the spring of the following year. The Kaiser Wilhelm Geschütz, known as the Paris gun, was fashioned by inserting a 21-centimeter liner into a 38-centimeter naval gun. Under this, a smooth bored extension was added. The resulting barrel was some 34 meters long and weighed in excess of 140 tons. The gun was so long that a superstructure had to be erected to keep it from drooping. In the quiet woods near the small French town of Crepy, the Germans built this gun emplacement, the remains of which are still visible today. An immense amount of pressure was needed to propel the shells 76 miles south to Paris.
Now that powder was so hot and the pressure was so high that every time the gun fired, it wore away because the flame temperature of the cartridge was hotter than the melting point of the steel. So each shell gradually increased in size and each shell was numbered.
Deterioration of the barrels was so severe they had to be replaced each month. The Allies tried desperately to silence the big guns. Railroad artillery was brought closer to attempt counterfire, and air raids were called in, but to no avail. The guns were well camouflaged and moved periodically between concrete emplacements that held them.
And the other interesting question is, if you're firing at a target 76 miles away, deep in enemy country, how do you know if you've hit it? And that was what was worrying the Allies.
The future and beyond has arrived, and the reality that Yuen Woo-ping helped create has returned. Samsung Plasma TV Special, The Matrix Reloaded and Beyond, and The Matrix Revisited. A 3-part behind-the-scenes special begins this Saturday on Pearl at 8:30. Samsung Plasma TV Special, The Matrix Revisited, is brought to you by Samsung Plasma TV.
Hello, everybody. SARS is a new disease, the prevention of which relies on good personal hygiene. Never spit in public. It not only spreads germs, it is also an offense. Also, wash your hands often with liquid soap, particularly before touching your eyes, nose, or mouth, and after sneezing, coughing, or going to the toilet.
Featuring the world's best golfers, US PGA Tour 2003. Thursday on Pearl, after the news roundup. What is The Matrix? Is it an action movie?
Guns. Lots of guns. Unfortunately, no one can be told what The Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
The Matrix, on Pearl's Movie of the Month, Sunday, June 1st.
After the war, it was discovered that German spies in Paris were relaying details on where each of the shells landed through operatives in Switzerland and back to Germany. With this information, the gun crews could adjust their fire. From March to August of 1918, the superguns fired some 350 shells into Paris, killing 256 citizens and wounding over 600 more. After the war, the Allies rushed to the woods of Crepy to retrieve the German supergun.
One of the great secrets of World War I was just exactly what happened to the Paris-Geschütz. When the French got in there, it was gone.
The German government treated it as a state secret for well after the war and actually locked up some of their citizens up for, technicians up for releasing anything about it in 1926.
The world may never know what became of the guns. All that remains are these concrete emplacements, mute witnesses to their mysterious disappearance. But 70 years later, the Paris guns would inspire the design of the greatest supergun of the century. The destruction wrought by big guns in the First World War echoed throughout the Second. Once again, both sides deployed large-caliber artillery in the form of naval weapons, coastal guns, and railroad guns. But none could compare to the massive weapons secretly developed by the Krupp factory for the Third Reich. As an infantryman in the First World War, Adolf Hitler had observed the destructive capability of big guns firsthand. He was a firm believer in the power of artillery. Shortly after he was elected chancellor, he asked the Krupp Company for a super weapon to penetrate the Maginot Line, France's deeply entrenched, heavily fortified first line of defense. At more than 1,300 tons, Gustav remains the heaviest gun ever made. 2 trains were required to move the massive weapon in pieces. When it arrived on site, 4 specially designed railroad tracks had to be laid to accommodate the gun, and the crane needed to assemble it.
While this was going on, 2 anti-aircraft trains were parked to protect it. A company of infantry were dispersed to protect it. It needed 1,250 men to man these trains, put the gun together and everything else. They took 3 weeks doing it.
Gustav could fire either a 4.7-ton high-explosive shell to a range of 29 miles, or a specially designed 7-ton concrete piercing shell, 24 miles. But the engineering of such a colossal weapon system was more difficult than Krupp estimated, and Gustav was not completed for Hitler's push into France. It didn't see action until the siege of Sevastopol, Russia, in 1942.
And the most spectacular one was when the anti-concrete shell went straight down into an underground magazine, naval ammunition magazine outside Sevastopol, and blew the thing sky high with one shot.
After Sevastopol, Gustav was sent to Leningrad, but arrived too late to take part in the siege. There's little evidence that it ever saw action again.
If you come right down to it, to spend millions of marks on a 1,300-ton cannon, which in the course of a 5-year war fired 25 shots, you're not really looking at something that you call cost-effective, are you?
Gustav, like the Paris gun before it, mysteriously disappeared. Parts were reportedly found in Russia and at the Krupp factory proving grounds. But after the war, all that remained was a spare barrel and some ammunition. By the fall of 1943, Germany occupied all of Western Europe. Only England stood between Hitler and total domination of the continent. Less than 100 miles from the coast of France, London was a tempting but unreachable target for conventional artillery, and therefore the driving force behind the development of another German secret weapon.
The high-pressure pump gun was a gun that had firing chambers on both sides of the main barrel. And the idea was that you started the round down the barrel, and as the round would clear each one of these chambers on the side, it would fire, adding more and more gas pressure behind the round, thereby kicking the round out to very, very, very long ranges.
The V3, also known as the Busy Lizzie or the Millipede, was designed as a terror weapon. Nearly 500 feet long, the guns couldn't be moved or aimed. They had just one target: London. In September of 1943, construction was begun in secret on a massive gun installation deep in a mountainside near Mimiax, France.
Cet ouvrage est très grand.
We are here in the railway tunnel that extends 600 meters. Inside this tunnel, you have an underground railway that measures 300 meters and was accessible by 11 galleries, each one 100 meters long. At the end of these galleries, there is a parallel tunnel 300 meters long. And on the other side of this tunnel, where 5 of these galleries meet, there are 5 launching sites inclined at 50 degrees. The cannons were 127 meters long, pointed in the direction of London.
De chacun 127 mètres de long.
The shells for the V3 were small by heavy artillery standards. Still, each gun had an expected rate of fire of up to 4 rounds an hour. In all, the guns at the site could have hit London thousands of times a day. when secret aerial reconnaissance photographs showed trainloads of material disappearing into a mountain near Mimiax, the Allies became suspicious. Without knowing the exact nature of the project, they initiated a massive bombing campaign on the site. The elder brother of the future U.S. President John F. Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy Jr., participated in the raids. He flew one of the planes packed with 10.5 tons of explosives bound for the site near Mimiax.
Et il avait pour mission, avec son copilote,
he and his co-pilot's mission was to fly the plane at a certain altitude, jump out with parachutes, and have the plane continue on autopilot to fly to its destination, where it would then destroy the structure. The plane, however, for reasons unknown, then blew up in the air. Many people suggest this was caused by a short circuit in the plane.
Ironically, by the time this attack took place on the 12th of August, 1944, the structure had already been destroyed by an earlier bombing raid. The Allies were not aware that the first mission had been successful. Left intact, the V-3 could have been one of the most devastating weapons of the war.
If it had worked, London would have been in ruins. Can you imagine 200 150-pound, 180-pound shells dropping on London every hour, day and night? The place would have been devastated. Thank God it didn't work.
Germany wasn't the only country engineering giant cannons. The United States built a supergun of its own. Little David was a 914-millimeter mortar designed for Operation Olympic, the top-secret plan for the invasion of Japan. The Americans felt that an extremely heavy mortar would be necessary to root out deeply entrenched Japanese positions. It took 2 tractors to tow the huge gun into position. One hauled the barrel, the other the steel mounting box. A hole was dug in the ground and the mounting was inserted with earth packed around it. Then a crane lowered the massive barrel into place. Like the guns of a bygone era, Little David was a muzzle loader. Once the massive round was inserted, the barrel had to be raised to seat it in place.
And off went this 3,700-pound bomb with, I think, about 3/4 of a ton of explosive inside it to a range of about 10,000 yards, something like this. Now, can you imagine 3/4 of a ton of explosive landing on top of a pillbox or a bunker or something like that? You would just remove it.
Operation Olympic was set for November of 1945, but before Little David could prove itself in battle, the war with Japan came to an abrupt end. Atomic bombs would dramatically influence the design of the next generation of superguns.
I don't want to go to a new school. All my friends are in my old school.
Don't worry. Mommy will handle it.
Lydia gets a Singaporean education.
Morning, children. My name is Lydia.
Mrs. Lam, shh, just won't admit you're wrong. Hong Konger.
Living with Lydia, Thursday on Pearl at 9.
The Ayatollah's son has a congenital heart condition.
How old is he? 15.
What to do when your enemy needs your help.
The Ayatollah's issued a statement.
Okay.
Denouncing it.
I won't aid the enemy. I'll let you know.
Schroeder Special, The West Wing. Thursday on Pearl at Serial 10:30.
When the amber rainstorm warning is on, listen to radio and TV announcements about weather and road conditions. When the red or black rainstorm warning is issued, schools should keep their premises open and implement contingency measures to look after arriving students until the end of school hours. They should release students only under safe conditions. Parents do not need to collect their children from school immediately. Students on their way to school should continue to proceed if conditions are safe, or return home or stay in a safe place.
Eddie Murphy with Eddie Murphy, opposite Eddie Murphy, with a special appearance by Eddie Murphy.
in the chemically balanced comedy. Weekend blockbuster, The Nutty Professor. Friday on Pearl at 9:30.
For all intents and purposes, the close of the Second World War marked the end for the supergun. The advances of long-range heavy aircraft rendered massive superguns obsolete. Still, the advent of atomic warheads suggested a new use for heavy artillery. First proposed in 1944, plans for an atomic cannon were abandoned when the war ended. But as the Cold War heated up, a weapon was needed to combat the massive numbers of tanks being produced by the Soviet Union. These mechanized forces threatened to overrun Europe. Had they been deployed, they may have faced the 280mm howitzer known as Atomic Annie. Commissioned into service in the mid-1950s, Atomic Annie could lob its nuclear charge up to 18 miles. A specially built tractor with twin cabs gave the 75-ton gun surprisingly good mobility.
But when they deployed this thing on exercises in Germany, it never got a chance for the tires to cool down before the enemy air were over it. And there was the great drawback. You can't deploy an old-fashioned, it has to be admitted, it is an old-fashioned cannon of large size against an enemy who has tactical air, short-range missiles, aerial photography. You can't conceal it. It's impossible.
As an early weapon, it was a very effective weapon, but rapidly was overcome by technology because the round was shrunk so that you could put an atomic warhead into an 8-inch gun round or a 155 round.
July 1962. These troops, forming a special task force, were the first in our Army's history to engage in a tactical exercise supported by live nuclear firepower.
This once top-secret U.S. Department of Energy film, declassified in late 1997, shows maneuvers featuring the Davy Crockett. 11 inches in diameter and just 51 pounds. The warhead was the smallest, lightest nuclear weapon ever deployed by the United States. With a range of up to 2.5 miles and an explosive punch the equivalent of about 10 tons of dynamite, Davy Crockett was a potent secret weapon to confront the Soviet tanks. Then Attorney General Robert Kennedy was on hand to observe what would be the last atmospheric detonation of a nuclear weapon to take place at this Nevada test site.
The Davy Crockett is probably the worst weapon system ever devised. I can only think of one thing worse, and that would probably be an atomic hand grenade. You had to point the weapon, you had to dig a hole, you fired the weapon, you jumped in the hole because you were in the blast radius of the atomic warhead. This is not a good idea.
More than 2,000 of the weapons were produced between 1956 and 1963. With the power of the atom in the hands of a soldier, Davy Crockett was the ultimate supergun. But there was still one man who thought the greatest gun was yet to be built. And one day he would build the most colossal supergun of them all. Born in Ontario, Canada in 1928, Gerald Vincent Bull was one of the century's greatest artillery designers. After the death of his mother, he was raised by an aunt who encouraged him in his studies at school. Young Gerald went on to become a brilliant student.
He always saw math as his area and went to the University of Toronto and again just excelled and excelled and excelled, and in fact graduated with a PhD at the age of 23, the youngest PhD that Canada had ever produced.
By the time he was 31, Gerald Bull had already designed a powerful gun that shot small rocket models as an alternative to expensive wind tunnel testing. On the 4th of October, 1957, the Soviets launched their first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. The Russian satellite would have a profound effect on Bull.
He wanted to launch a satellite for Canada. There was no way the Canadians could come up with the money to launch a satellite using rocketry. He felt that it would be possible to launch one with a gun, with a huge super gun.
In 1962, Dr. Bull was given an opportunity to test his super gun idea. As a professor at McGill University in Montreal, he secured American military support for a joint U.S.-Canadian feasibility study named HARP for High Altitude Research Program. On the island of Barbados and in the desert sands of Arizona, Bull began to push the limits of artillery. He was soon firing light projectiles up to 45 miles from small 5-inch guns. HARP's 7-inch guns fired up to 62 miles. Bull then focused his attention on a super gun. The HARP gun was initially fashioned by welding together two 16-inch battleship guns. More than 100 feet long, it was the biggest gun in the world. Although it was capable of firing a 3,000-pound shell, lightweight projectiles called martlets were the space vehicles Dr. Bull had in mind. He employed an ingenious method to house the small 8-inch wide martlets inside the gun barrel. The gap between the martlets and the barrel wall was filled in by wooden sabots that encapsulated the projectile in a shape similar to an artillery shell. Both the martlet and the sabots were protected by a base plate. When the gun was fired, the wood and the base plate fell off, freeing the projectile. Tail fins stabilized and prolonged the martlet's flight.
I remember as a child going there and having a lot of fun. You just see it fire and you just stay quiet, and it takes you by shock, even though you hear the countdown and you say 3, 2, 1, you're expected, and then you see the flash, it just takes you by surprise. And then a few seconds later you hear the bang, and that's a second shock for you.
On the 19th of November, 1966, Bull's Arizona gun fired a 185-pound martlet, 112 miles high. The U.S. Director of Project HARP, Charles Murphy, supervised the firing.
The record of 112 miles is a Guinness Book record which is still standing. It's the highest a gun has ever fired. Although the flight of the 16-inch gun was 112 miles straight up in the air, if we had wanted to try for a horizontal range record and brought it down to an elevation of about 50 degrees, the range that would have been achieved would have been 250 miles.
The 16-inch HARP gun was to be the launch pad for a small 3-stage rocket to boost a 20-pound payload into space. But before it could be developed, the Canadian and U.S. governments in 1967 terminated HARP funding. Dr. Bull was initially devastated. Despite the setback, though, he was more convinced than ever that guns could launch payloads into space at a fraction of the cost of large rockets. He would eventually find a well-heeled sponsor who would finance his dream, a Middle Eastern dictator named Saddam Hussein. In 1967, Dr. Gerald Bull retreated to his private compound on the border of Quebec and Vermont. He also quietly entered the arms business as a means to continue his research on super guns. The man who had fired his super gun higher than anyone else began to tinker